Hello, I'm Bettina Korek, CEO of the Serpentine Galleries. It's such an honor to introduce a conversation between my colleague Hans-Ulrich Obrist, Artistic Director of the Serpentine, and Agnes and Catherine Gund, two visionaries who have expanded the very frame of what arts philanthropy can achieve. The mission of the Art for Justice Fund is to invest in artists and advocates working together to end mass incarceration. It was such a privilege to work with Art for Justice on both editions of Freeze Los Angeles, first in 2019 on a limited edition artwork generously created by LA artist Mark Bradford, which raised more than $1 million for their urgent efforts. Vision for how art can make tangible social impact is so needed in today's world. I have so much admiration and gratitude for trailblazers like Agnes and Kat, who are affecting systemic change through all the projects and organizations they guide and support. As many of you tuning in know, Kat is also a brilliant filmmaker. One thread I especially enjoyed from the discussion you're about to see delves into her roots in do-it-yourself media production. More recently, she's turned her lens on the incredible life and patronage of her mother in the documentary Aggie. So important to retain the spirit that anything is possible, and at the same time to remember it is only through action that the possible can create new realities. Agnes and Kat have led careers defined by groundbreaking action. Enjoy their words today as they speak with Hans-Ulrich about their work, activism, empathy, and so much more. Thank you all for joining us today.
So thank you so much for accepting to do this conversation, and we are so honored and so excited to have the UK premiere of your amazing film online. And I wanted to begin with the beginnings and ask you both a little bit about your beginnings and then talk about the film. I read this wonderful conversation, Aggie, you had with Darren Walker, where Darren actually talks about and asks you about your passion for issues of justice and fairness, which you've had for a long time. And you mentioned that really this idea of empathy had a lot to do with your mother, but it had also to do with a woman named Henrietta Gibbons. Can you tell us a little bit about how it all began?
Well, that was way back when we were children. Henrietta was worked in our house, and she cooked for us and cleaned, and she was just woman of all trades, and she we didn't know much about her home life, but she was very influential on us because she had to follow the rules my parents set up, which were no in between meals, no cookings, no soda, no and things like that.
She was so integral into their family life, but that they were completely foreign. Her family life was totally foreign to them. But you did know that she didn't live with you. You knew that she lived somewhere else and had a family somewhere else. That was a window.
Yeah. We knew what she allowed us to know about her. I mean, this was a person that was, the one thing that I remember about her very much was how she was sort of weaving around the kitchen with delight because Truman won. She said, I knew he would win. And I thought, well, thank goodness my parents weren't down here to hear that. Or not my parents, but my father. Because my father was definitely a Republican, but she really allowed herself to say what she thought about that. But it was a big moment.
And we want to talk about art and activism and your film. And so I wanted to ask you, Aggie, how it all began with art. How, because you've had such, and you continue to have such extraordinary dialogues with artists, friendship with artists. Was there an epiphany? How did you come to art? How did art come to you? How did this dialogue with art get so intense?
Well, it was interesting because it really started when I was younger, that I used to collect things that were prints and sometimes drawings of artists. But I didn't know them and I didn't really have any connection with them. And then when I went to this school called Farmington, this person was the art history teacher, and two of us, Jill Spalding and myself, she was Jill Weldon then, and she and I both were allowed to take 2 courses from Miss McLennan, Sarah McLennan, who was a lovely person. I really got to love love art from that and art history.
You told me
that's
last
always
night that you thought that she was a lesbian.
Well, I think probably.
I didn't know that until last night, but I think that's interesting. She was also somebody who knew how to look at the world in a variety of ways, wasn't just trained in the one single path.
It's fascinating.
But she sent you, didn't she send you postcards?
She sent me postcards. From one I remember especially was because I went there a lot when I was in college and after, to the the Isabel Stewart Gardner, and she sent me the Rape of Europa, which was by Titian. That was one of the things they had at that, and she said, "You've got to come see this." And she got me interested in small museums like the Phillips. I've always been interested in the Frick is one of my favorite museums in the world, and the Morgan, and the Isabel Stewart Gardner, the smaller museums that you could be in them for about an hour, and that was, for me, it's enough. I would rather see something 6 times than 1 time thoroughly. I like to go around and see it, and then the next time I go, I usually see a whole different kind of configuration of things.
Yeah, and a more human scale of such house museums is also the intimacy, no? There is an intimacy of seeing art in a house, in a way.
Yeah,
And it's also now more familiar to how you live in your own house with the art. That being in a house and living with the art and sitting on a couch, having it in your periphery or having it on a daily basis.
Yeah,
it is a beautiful intimacy.
Yeah, that is exactly.
And then you came to New York, and you mentioned that actually it was the artists who brought you to New York. You wanted to be in the city of Jasper Johns, in the city of Roy Lichtenstein, and that's of course how you then also met Roy at the Tremaines. And can you tell us a little bit about how art brought you to New York, and artists really?
It was better for me to go where I knew people somewhat and was already involved with museums. In '67, I became on the P&S committee, which was the Painting and Sculpture Committee of the Modern. And then in '68, I was in the International Council, which was a thing that I loved, and I'm still in it. Sharon Rockefeller runs it now, and it was very, they were both good entries into the museum, because it was, though they were not directly the museum, that I didn't become a member of until, a person that was on the board until '76. So the '60s.
But that was, so you joined the board before we moved to New York.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And before we talk about, I have a couple of questions also for Kat, how you began and how you came to filmmaking. But I have one last question about to Aggie about beginnings, because we actually met for the first time when I started to do this project, Do It, where I invite artists to do instructions in art, from Louis Bourgeois to Mike Kelly to Theaster Gates. Many artists did instructions for this project, and then people can just do it. And together with you and with ICI, this idea was born to bring this project actually to the schools in New York City, and it became part of the curriculum. And whenever, you know, I'm being asked, and that all happened thanks to you, and whenever I'm being asked in terms of exhibition experience, what is my most important experience, I always said, you know, that a show can become part of the curriculum is maybe the most important thing, you know, for me. And that would not have happened without you. And you, of course, started so early with that, with the studio in school. And this was your answer in a similar way to the project actually now with the Equal Justice. There was an epiphany because you read that you know, the art budget in schools was slashed, and you reacted. Can you tell us about this epiphany, because it produced so many amazing things?
Well, it was in '76. They had an article in the New York Times, and it was on the front page, and it said they're going to cut, that they were going to cut recess, which I thought was really hard, and art and music and from the curriculums of the public schools. And I thought, this just isn't fair. So we went to Georgie Alexander Green, who was then the one left in the arts because the others had all gone at that time. And she found us 3 schools, and we started with 3 schools, and then that's the end of it. Tom Cahill now runs an institute part that is a part that has gone into other cities, Cleveland being one of them, and the Gun Foundation supports somewhat that program. And we've been in Boston and Memphis and Providence, and we hope to go, and Newark, and we hope to go into more schools, see more people, but COVID, of course, has gotten in the way.
But it is so clearly the foundation of what would be fair and just in this country. I see a straight line from Studio in a School to Art for Justice. You know, they would never talk about it this way, but it's sort of the ultimate socialist experiment that every child be honored and celebrated and given the tools to communicate and to self-identify and to value their own participation and contributions. And that's what Studio in a School said about the importance of art for children, was that it wasn't something that could be tacked on. It wasn't an elective. It had to actually be the backbone. And not only because children then can excel in reading and math, but the reason why they excel in their other classes with Studio in a School is because they are learning the tools to express themselves and to think critically.
And to say what they want, which is, you know, very often they don't get a chance to speak up in other classes. And this one, they do speak up. So it's good.
Now, that's what I thought. It's so important to talk about Studio in a School, because it leads directly to the Art for Justice initiative. But of course, there is also the very important beginnings of UCAT, actually, which are so essential when you began actually with activism and cinema. And I read that actually paper tiger television played a role. So that's again linked to do it yourself, because that's very DIY TV. And I read this morning the amazing interview Sarah Schulman did with you, the ACT UP Oral History Project. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about your beginnings and how you came to activism and cinema.
I think that Paper Tiger is a good place to start, because I actually didn't like television at all when I was little, and I had 3 siblings, and I kept trying to get them away from the television to play a game or do something. And so I was doing a lot of photography and painting in high school. Weaving, it's true. And during COVID, I've been obsessively making pottery. So, you know, there are these sort of, someone said the other day, it's like cross-training for my creative outlet, like cross-training as an artist, is that I'm doing all these different things. But when I got to Paper Tiger, it was really the politics that brought me to it. And I think the collective approach to filmmaking, which is still how I approach my work, it was about being with people, communicating, understanding. But the idea behind Paper Tiger is that Mao said that, you know, that imperialism was a he said a bean curd tiger, a tofu tiger, but that imperialism is a paper tiger, and it's so terrifying from far away. But when you get up close, you realize how flimsy it is and how easy it is to tamp it down, to destroy it, to tear it up. And so our idea was to actually embrace the media in the sense that we could start exploring Althusser's interpolation. We could talk about how the audience was being constructed by different media, starting primarily with the New York Times, but went on to do hundreds and hundreds, obviously not me, but I probably worked on 20 of them. And we would take different things. One example was a newspaper in South Africa that was called the Weekly Mail. And there were things that would say, you know, you can't talk about striking. It was against the law. You'd get thrown in jail if you mentioned that there was a strike. So they would put on the front of their paper, "Do not strike today." There was a little symbol of a little stick figure, which was their symbol to get the children out of jail, because the children were being thrown in jail. And so it meant free the children, and it was banned as a symbol. And so they put it on the cover of the paper and they said, "Do not put this symbol anywhere." And it was their constant way of sort of using the media against itself. And I think it really taught me how to do that, that I didn't have to shy away from using the means of production that I didn't like about television, but instead to actually make television that questioned television, make films that question film. And always sort of interrogate the production of it at base through the collective approach to making movies. And so I've always done that we started in ACT UP, a collective called Diva TV, which stood for Damned Interfering Video Activist Television. And it was a group of us. We had 4 or 5 cameras at the time, those big prosumer cameras. And we were counter-surveilling the police, but also providing newsreel for the future. Which has been accessed over and over since its 30-year anniversary of ACT UP, and there's been a proliferation of media that explores what was happening then. And of course now there's a huge resonance with the COVID crisis. Same government, different virus, different disease. But even in the current film, if you look through the credits, you'll see there's hundreds of people who are involved in helping realize that vision and that piece.
Now, also talking about ACT UP, it's actually very fascinating that you together went to demonstrations. Kat, you brought Aggie to demonstrations. There is the passage about the Gay Pride March where you went together. So that's of course another pre-chapter in a way to what's happening now.
I think it's been interesting in hindsight now as a 54-year-old person to look back. I also have 4 children, and to think about how we parent in terms of how we can model and mentor, but also keep learning. And one of the blessings from making this movie was really being able to observe up close and kind of analyze and have more of a connection to how Aggie models evolving as a human being, and how through her phases of her life she's been able to shift and change when her intuition told her that something wasn't right or something should go a different way. And instead of being sort of stuck in this mode of parenting as a know-all position, or once you're a grown-up you're set in your identity, she's really trusted her intuition, I think. And I loved how you called the reading of the article an epiphany, and also in the case of Art for Justice, seeing Ava DuVernay's artistic masterpiece, 13th, and that was also an epiphany. And that it's something where she allows herself to take the information as it's presented maybe in a new, slightly different way, because neither of those instances on the macro was new to her. So but it was something about how it was presented that really changed her and allowed her to then go in a new direction or go further in the same direction. And I've really appreciated that. And I think seeing the way that she was with me as a queer, more outspoken, sort of very political animal as a child and as a young adult, and never feeling that she was questioning me. She asks me lots of questions, but that's her process, but never questioning our connection, never questioning her. And, you know, people say unconditional love, and obviously that's what I mean, but there was also a partnership that I felt was never, I never doubted it. It was the most loyal of, you know, I felt like I could go. I didn't have very many friends who were able to come out to their parents and have their parent just in an interested way start asking some questions, as opposed to pretending that they had all the answers and tell you that you were wrong. And so it was important to me to show the give and take there, and how that's been a model for me to be with my children, to allow them to have many more answers than I have, and to be open to learning from them and from my mom to this day.
Maybe one more question, Kat, for you before we talk to both of you about the film. Many of your films actually have to do with portraiture. They're portraits. I adore the film on Chavela Vargas, which is a masterpiece, an absolute masterpiece. And then, of course, there is also the amazing Ron Arce film, Elizabeth Straub, and now Aggie. And of course, as I record a lot of conversations, I'm particularly interested in how you actually build these portraits on conversation. I mean, the whole, the Milagro of the Chavela Vargas film begins with this very early conversation you have with her before actually she came to world fame. Can you tell us a little bit about how one makes a portrait built on conversation?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think it would be that I'm just living my life. I've never set out to make a portrait of anyone. It's been sort of what my relationships are. And I was friends with Ron and with many people in the group that were performing at the time in the early 90s. And I went he said he wanted someone to just document, to just make sure that some of the performance and some of the exciting collaboration that was happening, the janitor magical time, that artistic time in Mexico and in Croatia. And so I wasn't even setting out to make a film about him. And certainly with Chavela, I wasn't. I just had that big camera still in my backpack. And when I got to Mexico after my best friend died, and in the early 90s, it had just been too much. And I literally bought a one-way ticket to Mexico, which I don't think you can do anymore. And I went down there and made friends with some different people. And they said, you have a video camera. And there's this woman, Chavela Vargas, she's 70. They thought that was like, we better hurry up and film something with her. Little did we know she was going to go on to live for 22 more years and become an international superstar. At the time, she had just gotten sober, just broken up with her girlfriend. And I knew very little. I just had you see me in the very beginning with my headphones and my short hair, and I'm just asking her some questions. And then that sat in my closet for 20 years. And so it was finding that material and then sort of building a story off of that by talking to the people in her life. And in Aggie's case also, I wasn't setting out to make a film with Aggie at all. I had asked her if I could film some interviews just so that I'd have some footage of her, because she's notoriously shy about being in the media. She doesn't like to be on camera. And she had said yes, and it just didn't work as a kind of one-on-one. And so then I started filming her with the kids, and then we enjoyed it. And we started inviting her friends, and we had shot more than 10 of these interviews before I realized I was gonna make a movie out of them. So I think that there's a way that I'm always learning from people. I'm like my mother in that way. I'm a people person. I thrive off conversation, literal and figurative, community, and so I think it was just an effort to be participating in my own life, and then art becomes a way to manifest that. You know, we could make dinner. I always say this, which I know you don't love: make dinner, make love, make a movie, like any of those things with any given person, and it'll end up, not any of those things with any person, but you know what I mean.
And that brings us, of course, then to the film, you made on Aggie. And of course, we have to begin that with another epiphany. And that's a question again for Aggie, of course, how it all began with the Art for Justice project. Because you mentioned in most of the interviews that there were several moments that it really, the beginning is the night of the Trayvon Martin killing. That was a moment you felt the urgency of that project. It has a lot to do with what you describe, Aggie, as a chemical reaction. When you actually saw the film by Ava DuVernay, 13th, where we can actually begins the film with Obama telling about the US having 5% of the world population, but having 25% of the world prisoners, this very shocking statistic. And you really woke up the next morning and decided that something had to change. Can you tell us about this epiphany?
Well, it was a very strong film, and I thought it would have episodes where they would be lynching somebody or something like that, which I didn't think I could face. So I was very glad that it was statistical and gave us a lot of facts about what was wrong. And I really just adored the film, and then went to Darren Walker, who I knew and had seen, and he jumped on the fact of doing this Art for Justice, and it was mainly his idea, and then he brought along people, especially Elena Wang, who we worked with now for 4 years.
Mm-hmm. You know, it was really a sort of tipping point, I think, for our nation as well. So you give that the statistic of we have 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated people. But if you think of how many people are coming out, and also how many people remain on parole and probation, there's 4 million people on under supervision outside the prison. It's the number of people mandates that we have to address this issue, because people can't work, people have no place to live, people don't have jobs, and we've severed all these familial relationships by doing this. So I think there was a way that Aggie at the onset of Art for Justice was a revelation about the leadership of formerly incarcerated people and what they were achieving at that moment, the visibility. People were starting to center and understand and listen and follow them. And that has only magnified in the 4 years since we started Art for Justice.
And what you're doing is so important. And of course, it started also with this idea of selling the Roy Lichtenstein painting. And actually that has, of course, to do also with something Ava DuVernay says in the film, that art requires imagination, and justice does as well. And so, Aggie, you had this idea that Roy Lichtenstein painting, which you've been living with for so many years, could actually produce reality. It's about production of reality. It could help change the world. When did you have this idea? And can you tell us about what prompted you to come up with this idea, but also to encourage other people to do that?
Well, people don't like me to mention it too much, but I have 6 grandchildren out of the 12 that I have that are Black, and they see themselves as Black. And I had just begun to see them as Black and recognize that they had qualities and abilities and were really just as, if not better people than other people. And that made it very clear to me that the system that we were living under, which had sent many Blacks to prison, and when they had really done things that many white people did and got away with and were overlooked, and they didn't get punishment, and they didn't have to live in a cell by themselves for years on end for doing things that other people had a pass for. So that was really what made me more interested, and I've only become more interested in, because what I learned about that, makes it very clear that we're a really unjust society about who we tag and who we stop on the road and who we shoot and everything, or chokehold or whatever that police are doing. And it's not because I'm anti-police, it's just that I'm anti the way many police officers react to Black people and people of color, that they really see them as menacing, and when they're not at all. The perfect example is Tamir Rice, who Catherine, because she's involved with the Gun Foundation in Cleveland, talks about all the time. He was in a park in front of his house with a toy gun, not even looking orange, not a metal gun. So obviously not a gun, but he was playing with that. He was 12 years old, and they didn't even say, "We are coming to arrest you." They just drove in and shot him, and he died that night from the wounds. So
Yeah. I made a film about that called Dispatches from Cleveland, about the police murder of that 12-year-old boy, which also looked at the systemic issues behind it, which I think are what drive the work we're doing at Art for Justice, and ultimately drive the passion that Aggie has, which is you can't just deal with one situation or one police officer. You have to actually change the entire system.
but it's true that if they've duplicated this now, they found with many of the deaths of Black young people, that they have found that, you know, there is something that draws police to stopping them and questioning them about things that, again, will, with more scrutiny, would not be done to white people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, we have to sort of end a whole system of punishment and violence, which is what the country's founded on. And as long as slavery is where we started and we've never veered away from it in any substantive way, we've never left the anti-Black racism behind, we've never left the culture of punishment and the criminalization and violence against Black people in order to maintain that system, we've never left that. And that is why we have to defund the police. That is why we have to reinvest in communities. We have to invest in what will make people whole and capable of participating, as opposed to treating people like animals and putting them in cages for 30 years or taking their children away at the border, taking their babies away from them at the border. I mean, these unconscionable ways that this government treats people, and the people in this country treat people. And we literally have to unlearn, and we have to have more white people speaking out. And that was also part of why I made the film, was, you know, we can't leave all discussions about race and racism to white nationalists. We need more people to model, which is why I appreciate that you mentioned that Aggie appealed to others to join her in that.
It's a model. It's a model for other people to follow. It's a trigger. Right. It's an instigator. It's a catalyst is maybe the word in English. No?
Exactly. And there were over 30 people who contributed in the beginning, and since then more and more. And as you know well, artists, Mark Bradford started it, and artists have been.
We were together at Freeze, actually, with Bettina Korek in Los Angeles when Mark Bradford did this project with you. Can you tell a little bit about this? Because that's another wonderful artist collaboration, which raised $1 million, I think.
It certainly did.
It did. He did a camera, as if, police, you know, just what a police would wear if they're out, they're supposed to wear. Although you find that they're turned off very often. But he did this in the center of a big paper, and it really is a striking example of something that appears to be little and appears in many you know, he had 100 of them, and it really sold out within no time.
And he had met, we went to visit him in his studio, and we brought a couple of our friends, fellows from the Art for Justice Fund, and he met these two wonderful artists and spoke to them and listened to them and got to know them a little bit. And because of that, he said, I would like the proceeds from the sales of this edition of 40 all to go to the Art for Justice Fund, because all money that comes into the Art for Justice Fund goes out. The Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors provide all the administrative support. So any money that comes in goes right out. And it has now started a whole lot of artists who are contributing. Julie Maritou, Mark DeSuvero, Jeff Koons, Dwayne Betts, and Titus Kafar, who are also Art for Justice Fellows, who have decided. And I think that Aggie never asked artists, they're asked all the time to contribute their work. But I think people gravitate towards something they see that is working, that is really part of changing the narrative and not just changing a policy or making an art piece, but actually recognizing what you quoted of Ava's, which is that art and justice are the same thing. And they're both about imagining something that's not there and making it there.
Now, somebody else who is important in the discussion is, of course, Brian Stevenson, and the extraordinary book, Just Mercy. Can you talk a little bit about the dialogue with Brian Stevenson?
Well, Brian is somebody I've liked since the first time I met him. And I think it becomes more apparent in Scott's movie, which was so strong, and that he goes to the South and he goes as a lawyer, and of course nobody believes that he's a lawyer, that he could be, because he's Black, and he's in the South, and he builds this where he had one person working for him at the very beginning, a white woman who was threatened all the time, but then he now has over 100 people that work for him. And he built this incredible lynching museum where he gathered the dirt from a place where a lynching had occurred, and then brought that in a jar and put it on the shelf of this museum, and then puts these big, really large pieces that hang from the ceiling that are part of this. Have you been to it?
I haven't been there. I want to go there, but I saw it in the film.
Well, you should go. I mean, it really is the epitome of what we're speaking about, because it's a place where art and justice and policy come together, because Brian's an incredible defense lawyer. But here he's the first to tell you that policy will not end racism, that only the culture change can end racism. And even as a lawyer, very busy and successful and important, vital lawyer, he made sure to include this memorial and museum as a place where he could help be part of the narrative change. And recognizing how all of those things are connected, I think, is part of his brilliance. And Scott Budnick was one of the producers, our friend, on the film Just Mercy, that's based also on the book that Aggie was referring to. And the film made it accessible to millions of other people.
And of course, one of the beautiful things about your film is that there are it's a polyphony, because there are many people in dialogue with Aggie. And I love it also, Aggie, that you then very often actually ask them questions. It's not only you turn the table, they ask you questions, but you ask them questions. And there is, for example, this very beautiful exchange with Julie Maritou, which is exactly about what you just said, that only art can lead to this empathy, no?
Yeah, well, that's true. And Julie is one of my favorite people, as well as of Catherine's, but she is so centered on what she does, but she does so many things that are on the periphery of that. And I was glad to see that Nina Simone's house that she helped preserve with Adam Pendleton and two others is now been taken over by a foundation that's going to pay for all the needed things.
Renovations and upkeep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing to see how artists respond to given moments when they're actually given a platform, allowed to speak and participate. And Julie's been a real inspiration during quarantine because she's been working so much. I think for a lot of artists, this kind of time to be in a space where they're not bothered by the market or the openings or the galleries or any of these ancillary aspects, and instead can really focus on this existential crisis we're in. I think Julie's a perfect example of that.
And to wrap it up, I wanted to ask you both to tell me a little bit about the experience of the film, because of course, Kat, you have made many portraits and we spoke about some of your amazing portraits, but I mean, this is a very, very special portrait. It's a portrait of your mother. And so I wanted to ask you both a little bit about how it was, about the experience of doing this film together.
You start.
Well, it had its life of its own. It, as Catherine said, started off with just these interviews with just me. This was what you know fascinates me so much about her filmmaking, is that she starts with so much and ends up with the core of the film, and that she really does know how to make a film, which is really great. So we saw it at Sundance first.
It was fun. There are a lot of things I could say about making a film about and with my mother, but one thing that it did help me do was to see the world through art, the way Aggie sees the world through art, and to try to replicate that in the film. And so it was a real privilege and honor to work with so much artwork. And there's over 200 pieces of art in the film. So to me, sometimes it feels like this feast. And I just want people to take that away from it, that art is a portal, and it's the portal through which Aggie's been able to do the things that she's done. And it just comes back to your most core essence and your relationships and your love. But that there's this kind of way that we chose to use art instead of even archival footage or archival photographs. We did these sort of art stories that would give you a feeling. And I always think of the Maya Angelou quote, where she says, you'll never remember what people said or even what they did, but you'll always remember how they made you feel. And I feel like that about Aggie and about art. And I hope people feel like that about the film, that they find something to relate to in it and some part of themselves reflected in it.
And that could almost be a wonderful, conclusion. However, I have my last question for both Katrin and Aggie, which is basically the question about the unrealized project, because the only kind of question in all my, interviews is the question about the unrealized project. And we know so much about architects' unrealized projects because they publish them all the time and they participate in competitions. And actually we know about their work very often, through them publishing unrealized projects, which later on, Frank Gehry is a great example for that. For a long time, some of his architectures were considered to be unrealizable. And then technology caught up, and because he had published his unrealized projects, he could then realize them. But we know almost nothing about artists, poets, philanthropists, basically all other practitioners, but architects, we know almost nothing about their unrealized projects. And I'm always very interested in, and particularly with you both, because you have realized so many things. Katrin has realized so many films, and Aggie has completely revolutionized philanthropy on so many occasions. And so I was curious, what are your unrealized projects? The unrealized project of Aggie and the unrealized project of Katrin. And it could, of course, be projects which are too big to be realized, or sometimes it's projects which have been censored. Sometimes it's projects which have been too expensive to be realized. Sometimes it's also projects one hasn't had the time, because time is of course limited. And then my friend Doris Lessing, the late Doris Lessing, she always says there are also the project one hasn't dared to do yet, that she called that self-censorship. So there are many reasons why projects would be unrealized. So I wanted to ask you, Aggie, and you, Katrin, to tell us about some of your unrealized projects.
I feel like I have so many.
Oh,
I have like the big ones and the small ones. I have ones that fit all your categories. I have one that I'm desperately working to realize called Just Media, which is an online platform that's a database of criminal justice media that would be accessible to everyone and searchable, and then would become, the programmer would be involved and a production people, and there'd be a way that the media that exists could be shared in the way that the artists and the activists who make it intended to be used. And it just would, I think, make good use of technology, which is not my friend really, but more interesting, I would say, is on a much more utopian level, that, to realize, like, I wish I could live or watch, like, I don't know if it'll happen on my death, but, like, what I really want to see is the next 7 generations, to see the people who are our village, our people, our families, that, and how they, I mean, I look at my children, I'm so inspired by them and their friends. And so I think, if there was some way to codify apprenticeship and fellowship and mentorship, Aggie speaks very freely and specifically about some of her mentors. And I think of how she's mentored me and others, and how important, how I wish people would speak about mentorship more and make it part of what, like art education, like mentorship. These are the things we should be teaching and providing our young people. So it would have to be something about that, the Hamlet. Although there's also a part of me that wants to be a midwife still. So maybe that's something.
Any unrealized films? Do you have unrealized films or unrealized portraits?
Oh, that's interesting, because I would say that, so much, I'm obsessed with the archives, and the archives before 2004 are completely different than after that, when everybody had a camera. So, I think all the time, I have this material, not quantity a lot, but things like that Chavella footage. And how can I mine the archive to help tell the story of today and to help envision the future by looking at what we already have? And I even said to Aggie, if the spikes went up and got terrible, I just said this last night, right? If we end up coming back to Connecticut full time again, like we did for the first few months of the quarantine from New York City, where there were 800 people dying every single day in the city. It was the saddest place, because in addition to just the bare loss, it was also this place that's about people and bustle and connection and magic and spark, and all of that was gone. And I said, if we end up here over the winter, maybe I would just bring up some of the old footage, like the footage I have from AIDS time and from being, being young, being young, and it's beautiful footage. There's not very much of it. But my relationships, my friendships, the people who died when I was in my very earliest 20s, my best friends, my family. And sometimes I meet people and I think, I wonder if that's what, when we were in New Haven, I and some of those young artists, and I thought, I wonder if that's what would have come of some of my friends had they survived. And what does it mean? What does that mean? I think, I make films to answer questions. And so all of my films are, all of my unrealized projects are films.
And that's a beautiful answer also, because of course, it's also the unrealized projects of other people. It's what these people could have done had they lived. That's a very beautiful answer.
Well, I think Catherine sort of answered it for me, because I was going to say my unrealized project, which isn't mine to be a project, but it's what I hope to see is my grandchildren having children of their own and bringing them up. And so that I just perpetuating this cycle of is very important to me, to see what the children will do with various things, because one of the things I like most is how Catherine has one child who is just 15 now, but every other month he is going to do something else, or he does something that you say, oh, that's what he should do. And but then he has an idea that he really wants to go into law or do something that is more tangible. But he says, but not for law itself. No, I don't want to be a lawyer and just stick with that. But so I like to see all 12 of them, what they become and what they do with their bodies in this world.
That's such a beautiful conclusion. Thank you both so much. This was an amazing conversation. I was actually thinking, I wanted to recommend you this book. My favorite book from the lockdown is this book, The Good Ancestor. Do you know this book? It just came out. It's The Good Ancestor. And it's written by Roman Krczarnik, K-R-Z-N-A-R-I-C. How to think long-term in a short-term world. And it has a lot to do with your last answer you both told me, about the long-term. And it's very beautiful because he describes how so many things right now are short-term in terms of the destruction of the environment. And he says we need deep time, humility, we need legacy, mindset, we need intergenerational justice. Also, I think it's very interesting, in terms of the environment, he says, that now humanity destroys the environment. And that means for all these young people, children, and the ones who are not born yet, they cannot protest against it. But we are basically destroying their planet. So he calls this intergenerational justice. And then he talks about cathedral thinking, about holistic forecasting, and transcendental goal. It's very connected to what you've both been speaking about. It's an amazing book.
Oh, good. I would like to get it, because books are what I can do now, is read books. So that's what I do. Rather than...
Thank you so much. This was so amazing.
Thank you.
So amazing. I hope to see you soon.
Okay.
Yes, that will be great. I look forward to that time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time, for this amazing conversation. See you soon.
Okay,
Thank
we'll
you.
see you soon.